Hyper Offense is probably the most fun type of style to play as in all of Pokemon, so I decided to do a small history of it throughout the OU tier Gens 1 through 9. Hyper Offense consists of mostly using Pokemon with explosive power to break down your opponent as fast as possible, with most of your Pokemon being all-out attackers, with usually a lead at the beginning to offer support. So, Generation 1. In Generation 1, Hyper Offense isn't exactly a thing, mostly because nothing is really a thing yet. Generation 1 has no items, no abilities, one special stat, and no physical special split, also no Dark and Steel types, and a very centralized metagame. Gen 1 was completely different. Normal and Psychic were the best types, fighting type moves were literally non-existent, and if you wanted to build a successful team, you pretty much had to use Tauros, Chansey, Snorlax, and Exeggutor, and then 2 Feathermons. It was a very offensively oriented generation, in the sense that no one was playing stall exactly, but I can't really say much about Hyper Offense in general because, quite frankly, most things don't exist yet. Generation 2. Generation 2 is what a lot of people would call a slower metagame, quote-unquote, although some people would disagree with that. But Generation 2 is also a very centralized game, where you can still max out all of your Pokemon stats, so Pokemon are far bulkier, and it's harder to OHKO everyone, or just generally KO. A Spiker and a Spin Blocker is a must on basically every single team, and it was a much more restrictive generation than what we can play now in most modern metagames, because mechanically, nothing was quite figured out yet. You can still max out your stats, no abilities, etc. the same as Generation 1. As well as overall, again, a very centralized metagame. Snorlax and Zapdos are basically on all of the teams. Hyper Offense doesn't exactly exist, but it doesn't mean that Generation 2 is stall. That's a common misconception. Generation 2 is not stall, that's just not true. It's also a very offensively oriented generation. It's just that because of spikes, max out stats, and the fact that leftovers was on 99% of Pokemon results in what feels like a much slower game, and what a lot of people think of as a passive metagame. So because of this, HO is not really existent because, again, nothing really exists yet in general. And there isn't enough Pokemon items and mechanics to develop a lot of archetypes / playstyles yet. Generation 3. Hyper Offense was more viable, but hindered by the fact that 2 to 3 of the most popular Pokemon at the time, Chansey, Skarmory, and Swampert, tended to be more defensively oriented Pokemon. However, this generation was the first one where you couldn't max out your stats. Something that I haven't really expanded on so far, but was probably lingering in the back of your mind, is the lack of physical special split. I didn't talk about it for the last gen specifically because I thought it was far more relevant here. The physical special split wasn't purely positive or negative, obviously. It's nuanced. However, regarding that in Hyper Offense, it definitely made it more difficult to make a good HO team, obviously. While finding good damaging moves is a critical part of every team, it's especially critical for Hyper Offense, because no matter how you slice it, the physical special split made it so that there was more variety in attacks for Pokemon, since not all Pokemon can be tailor-made for their specific type. The lack of physical special split was difficult for Pokemon like physical grass types, waters, dragons, dark types, etc. But also speed control wasn't really a thing. Sticky Web didn't really exist, Tailwind didn't really exist. That made things harder, obviously. But also, there's not that many super fast setup sweepers yet. The most popular one is probably Tyranitar, who isn't too fast, and items like Scarf and Specs don't exist, only Choice Band, as well as a general lack of priority moves. One thing that is very hyper offensive of Gen 3 and Gen 2 and Gen 1 actually, that isn't part of the next generations, Pokemon whose main role is just to use Explosion. But if you did want to try something more hyper-offense oriented, you would probably try Banded Dugtrio, or a Salicberry Heracross, Leftovers Alakazam, or Choice Specs Metagross as an Explosion. Also Explosion Gengar, Magneton to break through Skarmory, Salamence as well, and Pokemon to maybe set up hazards for some support at the beginning, like Skarmory. There are Pokemon that can work on hyper-offense. I would say that a lot of Pokemon in Gen 3 can find a place on a more hyper-offense-like team, but Generation 3 wasn't exactly the best for hyper offense. It was definitely not a slow metagame by any means, but the most common Pokemon of all time on there tend to be on the bulkier side. There are less super fast sweepers like in the modern gens, and commonly the most successful teams in Advance tend to be balanced or more bulky stall oriented. Generation 4. Generation 4 was a significant generation, not only for hyper offense, but Pokemon in general, as it now offered new moves like Toxic Spike, Stealth Rocks, Specs, Life Orb, etc. And obviously, the physical special split happened. This generation was undoubtedly better for hyper offense, especially because the split, as shown through Pokemon like Salamence, was great for offensive Pokemon. A Pokemon that was OU last generation rose to Uber specifically because it could now use its super high physical attack stats for its stab. Moves like Dragon Claw, which it previously had to use its special stat for, now he could use off this physical one. And Pokemon like Tyranitar could benefit from those attacks as well, as Dark-type moves didn't necessarily need to be special anymore. Pokemon that were forced to be mixed attackers can now just focus on one stat. And because more items were introduced, less Pokemon carried leftovers, which was pretty much the go-to item in the last 3 generations. This means that Pokemon are less bulky since they're not constantly recovering HP. You can see this when you look at the most common item section in Generation 3 versus 4. So now there were more offensive options and more hazards. This means Pokemon get worn down faster. Overall, Gen 4 was better for hyper offense. That's not to say that this was a full-on offensive metagame. I did a video on the history of Stall, and I also said that I considered Gen 4 was the first generation where Stall was actually kind of viable, as we still have Pokemon like Skarmory, Blissey, Hippowdon, and Bronzong, which are definitely more defensively oriented Pokemon that are super common here. I would say balance is still the most common playstyle. However, something that was also added as well that was good for hyper offense were priority moves. They were either completely new or just had better distribution, like Aqua Jet, Ice Shard, Bullet Punch, and Mach Punch. More Pokemon also got access to boosting moves, such as Swords Dance and Nasty Plot. And when it comes to hyper offense, Azov was a good lead in general, as it can set up rocks and has access to Explosion, as well as Infernape, who was also a great mixed attacker. Lucario, Scizor also both had mixed attacking capabilities, or Scarfed and Dean Dance Tyranitar, Gengar, Choice Specs, Latias, Aerodactyl, Scarfed Flygon, D-Dance Gyarados, Explosion Metagross, and up till recently, Substitute Machamp were all good options for this generation if you wanted to try something more hyper offense oriented. These are just the most popular choices. It's not everything obviously, but overall Generation 4 was a positive for hyper offense, as it just generally offered more variety. Generation 5. Gen 5 was huge for hyper offense, as it was probably one of the most popular playstyles, alongside of rain and other weather. Generation 5 brought huge things, like the newly nerfed Explosion and Team Preview. Gen 5 was a very fast metagame, pretty much synonymous with chaos. Hyper offense was very interested in Gen 5, more than the others, because there was a huge overlap between HO and weather. It's very turbulent. Not necessarily does every Sun and Rain team fit perfectly into the hyper offense mold, but it does come pretty close, in most cases at least, because weather teams are literally made to boost the offensive capabilities of your Pokemon, so obviously there's the overlap. I won't go too in depth into weather in general because that's not the point of this video, but I will talk about it a bit. So let's start off with the most popular weather in Gen 5, being rain. The only viable rain setter here is Politoed. There aren't that many good swift swimmers, but Kingdra and Kabutops are technically possible. Thundurus is a staple as well due to Volt Absorb. Tentacruel and Ferrothorn are there to offer support. Air Balloon or Life Orb Starmie, Toxicroak due to Dry Skin, and Keldeo all have a place on rain. And of course you cannot forget the obligatory Dragon type on almost every single team. That Dragon type was usually the Lottie Twins, a Dragonite, or a Garchomp. Although the history of weather is really turbulent when it comes to Gen 5, I would say that rain was ironically the most solid. Next is sand. Gen 5 in general was fantastic for ground types. Tyranitar was still an S tier Pokemon, Gliscor got Poison Heal, but most importantly, Excadrill was introduced, and Garchomp was unbanned. Excadrill had 3 really great abilities, and he loved to use all of them in Abuse to the Limit, but Sand Rush was eventually banned. So that left him with Mold Breaker being his most popular ability, which he used to get rid of Rotom Washes and pretty much anyone who would stand in his way. Next is Landorus, one of the most significant Pokemon to ever be introduced. Landorus was an incredibly versatile Pokemon, one of the best Choice Scarfers of all time. And besides Choice Scarfers, he would also have leftover sets or mixed attacking sets, and even Estes for his sets for a while at the very beginning of the tier. Gliscor at this point, who was actually more of an offensive Pokemon, usually using Swords Dance sets, very different from the version we know now. And Terrakion and Gastrodon were there for support on those teams, as well as Heatran as well with Air Balloon. Now I could go over Sun, but Sun is honestly really gimmicky because it got nerfed because of Chlorophyll. Now, as for non-weather hyper offense, this generation was also known for its Draco Meteors flying around, pretty much everywhere. Starting with the Lottie Twins. The Lottie Twins were able to sweep via Calm Mind or just generally dish off explosive hits with their Scarfed or Spec set. Draco Meteor was still unnerfed, which meant that Dragonite also loved to throw them around, and with his newly buffed multi-scale. As well as Garchomp that I mentioned, who was now unbanned from Ubers. He could work as a lead with Stealth Rock, but was also one of the most popular Choice Scarfers in the tier, because he basically had an ability to break everything that wasn't named Ferrothorn. And he was also probably the most popular Dragon type to pair with the Dragmax strategy. Besides that, there were also Kyurem Black and Salamence that were very popular and strong. For a while, Cloyster was also there, as he was literally busy decimating everything in his way, which is why he got banned semi-recently. Magneton, as I briefly mentioned, was also popular because of Dragmag, which if you don't know, is a strategy where you would send out your Magneton to trap a fellow Steel type, and then send out your Dragon type to decimate everything else in the tier, since literally nothing else resisted. Besides that, Volcarona was among one of the most impressive sweepers. You just needed to make sure that it could get a safe switch in. Generation 5 was a great gen for hyper offense, as many Pokemon that were more defensive in general fell to the lower tiers. and strategies like Weather, which are usually more offensively oriented, dominated the metagame. Generation 6. Generation 6 brought the most favorite gimmick of all time, that being Mega Evolution, as well as the Fairy types. So yes, absolutely Gen 6 had some great offensive Pokemon, but for a while, Hyper Offense was hindered by the prominence of Stall. If you play Gen 6 now, Stall is by no means overwhelming. It's definitely there, but it's not really a problem anymore. The reason it was a problem was because Sableye was OU legal for a while, and him and Gothitelle made a really devastating duo. It took a while, but it did get banned. So now, more into Hyper Offense. Sticky Web was introduced, which is one of the most important support moves when it comes to Hyper Offense, as it allows for easy speed control, especially pre-heavy duty boots. The only semi-viable one was Galvantula, which meant that there wasn't a lot of Sticky Webs going around, but still, it was significant. The only other options though were Shuckle and Leavanny and Ariados, so that kind of sucked. As for Hyper Offense mons, let's talk about Megas. Lopunny was a very popular Pokemon. Scrappy made it an amazing physical sweeper, since it was able to hit ghost types with most of its great stab options, as well as Mega Charizard Y being one of the most popular wall breakers in the tier, and Mega Metachamp who possessed the highest attack stat of all time in OU due to its amazing ability. Overall, pretty much all of the Megas had really great offensive potential. It's just that you had to choose carefully because obviously you were limited to one. Other than that, Azumarill was very popular because although it had always had that great ability, it needed a secondary typing to really boost it. Now that it was a fairy type, it was one of the most preferred offensive Pokemon. Excadrill was still a very popular Pokemon to pair with Tyranitar, and so is Garchomp, as well as Prime Talonflame, which at this point was a full-on offensive Pokemon for his terrible ball from Grace. Overall Hyper Offense was still viable in Generation 6, with lots of great options. It's just that Stall was as well, far more than in Gen 5, so that was kind of bothering it. But a good generation for Hyper Offense as a whole. Next is Gen 7. Ho had a cool new toy in Z Crystals, along with carrying the last Gen's gimmick as well. Now before I say anything else, I want to make clear that just like in Gen 6, Stall at the beginning was pretty dominant because they didn't ban Sableye and Gothitelle at first, but eventually they did and Stall stopped being terribly overwhelming. So, other than that, Z Crystals definitely helped Ho, since it was something that basically only benefits Pokemon offensively. It's just a super high base power move, and it was a detriment to Stall, because it was a cool new toy for particularly wall breakers to have. Now, defensive Pokemon like Toxapex or Skarmory have to watch out for when you're going to use that one special move that could potentially break through your team. Speed control. There was a new Sticky Web user on the block called Ribombee that had a fairy typing, a fantastic speed stat, and Quiver Dance. So overall, a lot more viable than Galvantula. Now the Alolan forms. The Alolan forms were honestly kind of disappointing if we're being honest, but one that I did want to mention was Alolan Ninetales, who made for a great screen setter. Now terrain teams. Terrain teams were most of the time pretty hyper offense oriented, that being Psychic, Electric, Grass, and Misty Terrain. Starting with Psychic, Tapu Lele being the only setter for that. Psychic boosted the power of Psychic type moves by 50% and made priority moves fail, and if a Pokemon has Psychic Seed, it gets a defense boost. These Pokemon that were on the teams usually were Mega Alakazam, Heatran usually with an air balloon, and pretty much any other Pokemon that you wanted on it. It wasn't a super restrictive team style. It was whatever you wanted to pair with Tapu Lele. Next is Electric Terrain teams, who would often feature obviously Tapu Koko as a Choice Scarf for a pivot, Zurichi with Tail Glow, Hawlucha as a sweeper, and Zorora. Grassy Terrains. Grassy Terrain was a bit less popular because Tapu Lulu was just not as good. However, Grassy Terrains would feature a very common offensive Pokemon, Kartana, who had the highest attack stat in the game at this point, not just in the tier, but in the game. They would also usually feature Heatran as well, and Landorus and Ferrothorn, and sometimes even the rare Mega Sceptile. Next is Misty Terrain, which featured Tapu Fini, Mega Mawile, Heatran, again because Heatran is literally everywhere, or even Kartana too, since it just doesn't hurt to have a Pokemon with a super high base total like that. Honestly, I would say that they were all more offensively oriented, but especially Psychic and Electric type fit more into the HO description. Next, I want to talk more about a certain Uber Pokemon that was now OU legal in Greninja. Greninja had two amazing abilities in Battle Bond and was a really popular Life Orb, Choice Spexer, or Z Crystal move user. And pretty much all the threats from last gen were still good Pokemon to have on your HO team this one as well. In general, Gen 7 was good for hyper offense, bringing a lot of new threats and cool new gimmicks. Gen 8. Gen 8 brought the most hyper offense gimmicky gimmick of all time in Gigantamax. I would say Gen 8 was a good generation for HO as well. We introduced Grimmsnarl with the ability to set up screens via Prankster, so now you had more variety and didn't just have to use Alolan Ninetales. Speed control wise, there wasn't really anything new, but you could still use Ribombee from the last generation. There were overall lots of amazing new physical threats. Overall, lots of the Pokemon introduced were great offensively. because this generation, even without Megas and the gimmick removed, because there were still the Ultra Beasts from last generation, and Lex Pokemon were a victim of Dexit. Although Stall was still viable, the most popular Pokemon introduced this gen were definitely more offensively oriented, like Dragapult, the pseudo legendary with an amazing dual typing. He was a popular choice specs and life user with a huge speed stat that could outspeed even Scarf threats. Pokemon like Melmetal, Boswell, Rillaboom, Urshifu Rapid Strike, Weavile, the Tapu's Volcarona were all super common. And speaking of Volcarona, while there were a lot of new offensive powerhouses introduced, a very important item was also introduced as well, as in Heavy Duty Boots. Heavy Duty Boots was definitely good for some offensive threats, like Volcarona. Mostly, it was beneficial more to defensive Pokemon. Why? Well, Stall is by nature a more reactive playstyle, which means that they're going to be switching in and out a lot. That means that one of the best way to take them down is by setting up hazards so that they take damage every time they try to do their thing. However, now with Boots, one of their best weapons were taken away, and Pokemon were a lot more relying on knockoff to get that chip damage in. It wasn't a huge detriment to Hyper Offense, it was still viable, but it definitely hurt them. However, as a whole, even after the Gigantamax band and Boots, it was still a viable option. This takes us to our current gen. Hyper Offense is really good here, honestly. Terra is a gimmick that I know a lot of people have said it before, but basically it's just a gimmick to let the rich get richer. Yeah, Terra can be defensively and offensively beneficial, but it's mostly good for already strong Pokemon, because they can Terra into their pre-existent typing and give them a +2 boost. And if we take a look at the Pokemon that were banned this gen, like Regilightning, Volcarona, Terra was the thing that pushed them over the edge, and they're both offensive Pokemon. On top of that, Stall isn't as good this gen because of the nerfed movesets. Pokemon like Blissey and Toxapex, who were defensive behemoths, now aren't used as much. On top of that, the new mechanics like Photosynthesis and Quark Drive that give Pokemon boosts are really mostly used offensively. Yeah, you can get a defensive boost, but it's usually used to boost your attack stat or your speed stat. It's a common thing that people say that this gen's OU is just uber's light. And we can see it as defensive Pokemon have fallen, yes, but also offensive threats that we never thought would fall, or at least would take a lot longer to fall off. Tyranitar, Greninja, Weavile, Garchomp, and Excadrill have all fallen to UU. This is probably the best generation since Gen 5 for Hyper Offense. And it's because this generation is so chaotic. With so many new threats and mechanics, it's hard to account for all the multiple sets that every single Pokemon can be running. It's probably one of the most common complaints about this tier and this generation. Pretty much every Pokemon in OU is good for Hyper Offense to some degree. Pokemon like Grimmsnarl, Glamora, Deoxyspeed, Araquanid, Gliscor, Great Tusk, and more are good for setting up hazards, as well as Hisui and Samurott. And the best Hyper Offense Pokemon are Darkrai, Enamorus, Roaring Moon, Iron Moth, Iron Valiant, Goldengo, Dragonite, Kingambit, Kyurem, Meowscarada, Raging Bolt, Rillaboom, Walking Wake, and more. The majority of Pokemon in this tier can honestly find themselves on Hyper Offense teams. It's a very high power tier and very good for HO. That concludes my very small history of Hyper Offense. I know I missed a lot, so feel free to comment.